The most expensive mistake in business isn't trusting the wrong person. It's ignoring the right one. The rain tapped softly against the glass walls of Blackwell Tower as Manhattan disappeared behind a curtain of gray. 47 floors above the city, executives in tailored suits gathered around a polished walnut conference table worth more than most families earned in a year. A merger valued at $4.2 billion was only minutes away from becoming official. Lawyers reviewed final pages. Financial advisors exchanged confident nods. Assistants moved quietly around the room with tablets and coffee. Everything appeared perfect. Everything except for one small detail that nobody noticed. Claire Whitmore balanced a silver tray against her hip as she stepped into the executive conference room. At 28, she had mastered the art of being invisible. The quiet waitress from the cafe downstairs was familiar to many of the employees in the building, yet few remembered her name. They remembered their coffee orders. They remembered their meetings. They rarely remembered her. And Claire preferred it that way. Her blonde hair was neatly tied back. Her black uniform was simple and professional. Her movements were calm and precise. She delivered coffee the same way a concert pianist touched piano keys, with focus, discipline, and attention to details most people never saw. "Fresh coffee, Mr. Blackwell," she said softly. Ethan Blackwell barely looked up. At 39, the CEO of Blackwell Capital had become one of the youngest billionaires on Wall Street. His reputation was legendary, brilliant, demanding, relentless. He signed billion-dollar agreements the way most people signed restaurant receipts. "Thank you," he said automatically, his attention fixed on the thick contract spread before him. Around the table, attorneys continued discussing clauses and compliance language. Numbers filled the room. Percentages, deadlines, guarantees, the language of power. Claire began placing cups in front of the guests, one by one, quietly, efficiently. Then she reached the far end of the table. A page lay partially exposed beside an open folder. She wasn't trying to read it. She wasn't curious about corporate secrets. But her eyes landed on a signature. And instantly, something felt wrong. Her hand stopped. The tray shifted slightly. A porcelain cup rattled against its saucer. The sound was small, almost invisible. Yet Claire felt her heartbeat slow. Her gaze returned to the signature. One glance became two. Two became three. The room continued moving around her. Lawyers spoke. Executives nodded. Rain tapped against the glass. But Claire saw only the ink. The final stroke. The angle. The pressure. A detail so tiny that nobody else appeared to notice it. Her stomach tightened. No, that couldn't be right. She leaned forward slightly, just enough to confirm what her instincts were already telling her. The signature belonged to Ethan Blackwell. Or at least it was supposed to. Yet something about it felt manufactured, rehearsed, artificial. Claire stared at the final loop of the last name. Then she looked toward Ethan. Then back at the page. The tray slipped slightly in her grasp. Several heads turned. "You okay?" one executive asked with a faint smile. Claire swallowed. Her pulse remained steady. Her voice almost disappeared beneath the hum of the room. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "but I think there may be a problem with that signature." The room fell silent. For several seconds, nobody moved. The silence felt heavier than the storm outside. One attorney slowly removed his glasses. Another exchanged an amused glance with a colleague. Across the table, a senior partner from one of the most respected law firms in New York leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. Claire immediately realized every eye in the room was now fixed on her. The invisible waitress was invisible no longer. Ethan Blackwell studied her face carefully. His expression remained unreadable, calm, controlled. The same expression that had unsettled competitors for more than a decade. "What exactly do you mean?" he asked. Claire tightened her grip on the tray. "I am sorry," she said. "I should probably stay out of this." A few people nodded, clearly hoping she would do exactly that. "That would be wise," one attorney said with a polite smile. Soft laughter followed. Not cruel, just confident. The confidence of people who spent years earning credentials displayed in expensive frames. Claire lowered her eyes toward the document once more. The signature still bothered her. The feeling refused to leave. "Miss," Ethan said, "you already spoke. You might as well finish." The room grew quiet again. Claire hesitated. She had spent years avoiding attention, years learning that speaking less often made life easier. Yet something inside her would not let her walk away. "The final stroke," she said quietly. "On your last name." Several attorneys looked down at the document. What about it? Someone asked. Claire carefully placed the tray on a nearby side table. The pressure changes too suddenly. A lawyer blinked. Pressure. The pen pressure. Claire pointed carefully without touching the page. The signature starts naturally. The flow is strong, consistent, but the final curve becomes hesitant. Another lawyer smiled. You determined that while serving coffee? More restrained laughter. Claire ignored it. People who imitate signatures usually focus on appearance. They memorize shapes. They copy movement. But they often miss rhythm. The smiles began fading. Ethan looked down at his signature, then back at Claire. Go on. Claire swallowed. The final stroke should accelerate. She paused. This one slows down. One of the attorneys frowned. Another leaned closer to the page. The room no longer felt amused. It felt curious. That could happen naturally, someone argued. Of course, Claire replied. But there is something else. Ethan folded his hands together. What? Claire looked directly at him for the first time. The ending curve shows hesitation before completion. She pointed toward the final loop. Whoever signed this was thinking about getting it right. Nobody spoke. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Far below, Manhattan traffic continued moving through the afternoon. Up here, however, time seemed frozen. Ethan reached for another document inside the folder. A previous agreement. He placed it beside the new one. Then another. And another. For signatures sat side by side. The attorneys leaned forward. One by one. Their expressions slowly changed. Confidence gave way to concentration. Concentration gave way to uncertainty. Claire felt her stomach tighten. She had not expected this. She had expected dismissal. Maybe embarrassment. Instead, she watched highly educated professionals stare at the signatures as if seeing them for the first time. Then one attorney whispered the last thing anyone in the room expected to hear. Wait a second. The attorney who had spoken first reached for the documents again. His confidence was gone now. He adjusted the papers under the conference room lights and studied each signature carefully. One page, then another, then a third. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody checked a phone. Nobody looked away. The room that had been preparing to celebrate a multi-billion-dollar merger was suddenly focused on a few inches of blue ink. Ethan Blackwell remained silent. His eyes moved between the signatures and Claire. The waitress stood quietly beside the wall, wishing she had never spoken at all. Attention was uncomfortable. Questions were dangerous. She had spent years building a life that did not require explanations. Look at the spacing, the attorney finally said. Several heads turned. The spacing? Asked another lawyer. Between the final letters. He pointed carefully. It is subtle, extremely subtle, but it changes. The second attorney leaned closer. Then another. Then another. One by one, the experts who had dismissed Claire moments earlier began examining the page with growing concern. Ethan watched the transformation unfold. He knew these people. They were among the best legal minds in the country. Men and women who billed thousands of dollars per hour. People who rarely admitted uncertainty. Yet uncertainty was exactly what he saw now. Could this simply be variation? One executive asked. Everyone signs differently sometimes. The first attorney nodded slowly. Normally, yes. He paused. But this many differences on a signature attached to a $4.2 billion agreement. No one answered. Rain continued sliding down the glass walls. The city beyond looked distant now, almost unreal. Ethan reached for the contract and studied the signature himself. He had signed thousands of documents throughout his career. Most of them blurred together. Yet the longer he looked, the more uncomfortable he became. There was something unfamiliar about the handwriting. Not enough to trigger immediate alarm. Just enough to create doubt. And doubt was dangerous, especially in business. Who prepared this final copy? Ethan asked calmly. A senior executive across the table straightened in his chair. The legal review team finalized it this morning. Who had access? Ethan asked. The room grew quiet again. The question seemed simple. It was not. A merger of this size involved dozens of people. Lawyers, analysts, executives, consultants, assistants. Any one of them could have handled the document. Any one of them could have missed something or hidden something. Claire lowered her eyes. This was no longer about handwriting. The atmosphere had changed. She could feel it. The room no longer viewed her as an interruption. They viewed her as a problem. Because if she was right, then somebody else had been wrong. Suddenly, Ethan stood. The movement was small, but it immediately commanded attention. He closed the folder and placed both hands on the table. "Nobody leaves," he said calmly. "Not until we verify every page." No anger. No raised voice. Somehow that made the words even heavier. Several executives exchanged nervous looks. One attorney picked up his phone. Another requested access to archived signature records. The meeting that had been scheduled to end in 20 minutes was beginning all over again. And standing quietly beside the wall, Claire felt a familiar feeling she had not experienced in years. The feeling that a single detail, ignored by everyone else, was about to change everything. The next hour unfolded like a storm moving beneath calm water. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody panicked. Yet tension settled over the conference room so heavily that even the sound of pages turning seemed loud. Archived documents began arriving from multiple departments. Contracts from 5 years ago, annual reports, acquisition agreements. Hundreds of signatures collected throughout Ethan Blackwell's career. The legal team spread them across the conference table. Comparison after comparison. Analysis after analysis. Claire remained near the wall, wishing she could quietly return to the cafe downstairs. Instead, every few minutes, someone glanced in her direction. Not with amusement anymore. With curiosity. Ethan noticed it too. The room had changed. The waitress who had entered carrying coffee now carried something far more powerful. Uncertainty. One senior attorney adjusted his tie and rubbed his forehead. "I do not like this," he admitted. Another nodded. "Neither do I." Ethan looked at them. "How bad?" The attorney hesitated. For the first time all afternoon, he seemed uncomfortable answering. "Bad enough that I would not approve this agreement until we finish verifying everything." The words landed heavily. A $4.2 billion merger was now frozen because of a concern raised by someone who was not even supposed to be in the meeting. Across the room, a legal analyst projected enlarged signature samples onto a screen. The final strokes appeared larger than life. Curves, loops, angles, tiny details transformed into evidence. Ethan stood and walked closer. The signatures looked nearly identical. Nearly. The difference was almost invisible until someone pointed it out. Then it became impossible to ignore. "There," Claire quietly said before she could stop herself. Several heads turned. She immediately regretted speaking. Ethan looked toward the screen. "Show me." Claire hesitated. "The pressure pattern." She pointed carefully. "Here." The analyst zoomed in further. The room became silent. Again. "Interesting," the analyst whispered. "Very interesting." Ethan folded his arms. "Explain." The analyst swallowed. "The movement appears copied." He enlarged another sample beside it. "This signature shows confidence. Continuous motion." Then he pointed at the question document. "This one shows observation. Correction. Replication." Nobody smiled this time. Nobody laughed. One executive slowly sat back in his chair. Another stared at the screen as if seeing a ghost. Ethan felt a cold realization forming. Not proof. Not yet. But possibility. And possibility alone was enough to stop everything. His phone buzzed. He ignored it. Another attorney entered the room carrying a folder obtained from secure archives. "You need to see this." The folder was placed on the table. Inside were handwritten authorization forms signed personally by Ethan over the past decade. The legal team compared them side by side. Minute after minute passed. Then the oldest attorney in the room, a man who had practiced corporate law for nearly 40 years, slowly removed his glasses. His expression had completely changed. "Mr. Blackwell," he said quietly, "I believe the waitress may have saved us from making a catastrophic mistake." Across the room, Claire lowered her eyes toward the floor. She did not feel victorious. She did not feel proud. She felt something far more troubling. Because the more evidence appeared, the more one question refused to go away. If the signature was not genuine, then who had placed it there in the first place? The question settled over the room like a shadow. Nobody answered it because nobody could. The forged signature was no longer a theory. It was becoming a fact. And facts had consequences. Ethan Blackwell walked slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. Thousands of lights had begun appearing across the city as afternoon faded into evening. Normally, he enjoyed moments like this. Moments of clarity, control. Today felt different. Somewhere inside his company, someone had manipulated a document tied to one of the largest deals of his career. Behind him, legal teams continued working. Laptops opened. Calls were placed. Internal records were requested. Every minute revealed another layer of uncertainty. Claire quietly reached for her tray. She had stayed far longer than any waitress should have. Her shift downstairs had ended nearly an hour ago. "Mr. Blackwell," she said softly. Ethan turned. "Yes, I should probably leave." Several attorneys looked up immediately, almost as if they had forgotten she was still there. Ethan studied her for a moment. "No," the answer surprised everyone, including Claire. "No." Ethan nodded toward an empty chair near the end of the conference table. "Sit down." Claire blinked. "I am not part of this meeting." "You are now," Ethan replied. The room fell quiet once more. A waitress sitting at the executive table of Blackwell Capital would have seemed ridiculous only 2 hours earlier. Yet nobody objected. Not anymore. Claire hesitated before carefully taking the seat. The leather felt unfamiliar beneath her. Expensive. Out of place. Like she had accidentally wandered into someone else's life. Across the table, a young analyst hurried into the room carrying a stack of printed records. "We found something." Every head turned. The analyst spread several pages across the table. Access logs. Document histories. Internal review records. Ethan stepped closer. "Talk to me." The analyst swallowed. The signature page was modified yesterday evening. A ripple of concern moved through the room. "By whom?" Ethan asked. "We are still tracing that." The analyst pointed to the records. But this version was not the original file. One attorney leaned forward. "You are saying the document changed after legal review?" "Yes." Nobody spoke. The implication was obvious. Someone had inserted a new page. Someone with enough access to avoid immediate detection. Claire felt the atmosphere tighten again. This was no longer a technical mistake. It was becoming deliberate. Ethan looked down at the records, then toward the executives seated around him. Faces he had worked beside for years. People he trusted. People who had helped build the company. Suddenly trust felt fragile. One attorney quietly closed his folder. "The merger cannot proceed." Ethan nodded. "Agreed." For $1 billion sat suspended by a single decision. Yet nobody argued. Not after what they had seen. Claire glanced toward the screen displaying the enlarged signature. The same feeling returned. The feeling she had experienced the moment she first saw it. Something else was wrong. Something everyone was still missing. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Then she noticed a tiny notation near the bottom of the document history. Small. Easy to overlook. The kind of detail most people would ignore. Claire felt her heartbeat slow. She stared at it for several seconds. Then she looked up. "Mr. Blackwell," she said quietly. "I think there is another problem." Every conversation in the room stopped. Ethan Blackwell turned toward Claire immediately. The reaction was different now. Hours earlier, her words had been met with polite smiles and quiet skepticism. Now they commanded attention. "What did you find?" Ethan asked. Claire looked at the projected document history on the screen. Hundreds of entries filled the timeline. Most were routine. Reviews. Revisions. Approvals. The kind of digital trail every corporate document left behind. Yet one entry stood apart. Small. Almost invisible. "That timestamp," Claire said softly. The analyst zoomed in. Several attorneys leaned forward. "What about it?" Claire studied the screen. "The signature page was modified yesterday evening." "We know that," one attorney replied. "Look at the time." The room became quiet again. The analyst enlarged the entry. The modification had occurred at 8:17 p.m. Ethan frowned. "Explain." Claire hesitated. She was no longer discussing handwriting. This was different. "The cafe downstairs closes at 8 o'clock. Several people exchanged confused looks. "And?" Ethan asked. Claire pointed toward the building access records displayed beside the document history. "I serve coffee in this building every day." She paused. "The executive floors are almost empty after 8. The analyst looked back and forth between the records. Slowly, his expression changed. "Wait." He began typing rapidly. Security logs appeared on the screen. Entry records. Elevator access. Employee movement data. The room watched silently. Then the analyst stopped typing. His face turned pale. "She is right." Nobody moved. At 8:17 p.m., only 3 employee access cards were registered on this floor. A murmur spread across the room. 3 people. Out of thousands of employees. Suddenly the list of possible suspects became dramatically smaller. Ethan stepped closer. "Who?" The analyst swallowed. "One was a maintenance supervisor." He pointed at the screen. The second was an information technology administrator. Another name appeared. And the third, he stopped speaking. The room waited. The third was a senior executive assigned to the merger team. Silence. Complete silence. The executive in question sat only a few seats away from Ethan. Richard Holloway, Executive Vice President. 15 years with the company. Trusted, respected, reliable. Richard immediately shook his head. This is ridiculous. His voice remained calm, but something had changed. My access card was used because I was working late. That proves nothing. Ethan nodded slowly. Agreed. Richard visibly relaxed. Then Claire spoke again. No, every head turned. Claire looked uncomfortable, almost apologetic. It proves something. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. And what exactly does a waitress think it proves? The words hung in the air. Not hostile. Not loud. Yet the room felt colder afterward. Claire lowered her gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the screen. It proves whoever changed the document knew the building would be nearly empty. Nobody interrupted. It proves they understood security procedures. Her voice remained quiet, steady, and it proves they expected nobody to notice. The analyst stared at the records again. Suddenly, he opened another file. There is more. His voice barely rose above a whisper. The modified page was uploaded from a workstation assigned directly to the merger executive suite. Ethan's expression hardened. For the first time all evening, uncertainty was beginning to take shape. Not into answers, into direction. And as the rain continued falling against the glass outside, Claire realized the mystery surrounding the signature was no longer expanding. It was narrowing. The room felt smaller now. Not physically, emotionally. Every new piece of information seemed to pull the walls closer together. Richard Holloway sat perfectly still at the far end of the conference table. His suit remained immaculate. His expression remained controlled. Yet Ethan Blackwell noticed something he had never noticed before. Richard was no longer asking questions. Everyone else in the room wanted answers. Richard wanted the conversation to end. This proves access, Richard said calmly. Nothing more. Several executives nodded. It was a reasonable point. Access was not guilt. Opportunity was not proof. Ethan remained silent. He had built his career by refusing to jump to conclusions. Assumptions were expensive. Facts mattered. He is right, Ethan finally said. A visible wave of relief passed across several faces. We do not have enough. Claire looked down at the table. She agreed. Something still felt incomplete. The evidence pointed in a direction, but directions were not destinations. Then another analyst entered the conference room, carrying a tablet. He looked nervous. Sir, he said, we found the backup server copies. The room immediately became attentive. Show us, Ethan said. The analyst connected the tablet to the large display screen. New files appeared. Timestamps, metadata, recovery logs, digital fingerprints left behind by every document revision. The kind of information most people never thought about. The kind of information computers never forgot. The modified signature page was uploaded at 8:17 p.m., the analyst said. But that is not the interesting part. He opened another window. Several attorneys leaned forward. What is it? One asked. The analyst swallowed. The original page was deleted exactly 3 minutes earlier. Silence. Complete silence. Ethan stared at the screen. Deleted by whom? The analyst enlarged the log entry. Every eye followed the cursor. Then a name appeared. Nobody spoke. Not immediately. Richard Holloway looked toward the screen, then looked away. The deletion had originated from credentials assigned to his executive workstation. One attorney slowly removed his glasses. Another rubbed his forehead. Nobody seemed eager to speak first. Finally, Richard exhaled. That is impossible. His voice remained steady. Someone must have used my terminal. Ethan watched him carefully. Not as a friend. Not as a colleague. As a businessman evaluating information. Can you prove that? Ethan asked quietly. Richard opened his mouth, then stopped. The answer never came. Across the room, Claire felt her stomach tighten. The atmosphere had shifted again. This was no longer an abstract mystery. It was becoming personal. Very personal. The analyst continued reviewing the records. Then his eyes widened slightly. There is something else. Ethan turned toward him. What now? The analyst pointed at another entry hidden beneath the first. The deletion was performed from Richard's workstation. He paused. But the approval code attached to the upload belonged to someone else. Confusion spread across the room. Someone else? Ethan asked. The analyst nodded slowly. A second person was involved. Suddenly, the mystery became larger instead of smaller. The forged signature, the altered file, the hidden upload. None of it belonged to one individual anymore. Somewhere inside Blackwell Capital, two people had touched the same document. And for the first time that evening, Ethan realized this was not merely a mistake hidden inside a merger. It was a coordinated plan. The conference room became impossibly quiet. Two people, not one. The realization changed everything. A single mistake could be explained. A coordinated effort was something else entirely. Ethan Blackwell slowly returned to his seat. His eyes never left the screen. Years of building companies had taught him one lesson above all others. Complex plans rarely failed because of major errors. They failed because someone overlooked a small detail. Tonight, that detail had been noticed by a waitress. Whose approval code was used? Ethan asked. The analyst hesitated. We are verifying that now. Fingers moved rapidly across keyboards throughout the room. Attorneys reviewed records. Technology specialists opened additional security logs. Every minute uncovered more information. Claire sat quietly, watching the process unfold. She still felt out of place at the executive table. The expensive suits, the legal language, the billion-dollar decisions. None of it belonged to her world anymore. Yet somehow she remained at the center of it. A notification suddenly appeared on the main screen. The analyst froze. I found it. Nobody moved. Read it, Ethan said. The analyst swallowed. The secondary approval code belongs to Melissa Grant. Several executives exchanged startled looks. Melissa Grant was not a junior employee. She was director of corporate compliance, one of the most trusted people in the organization. Her entire job existed to prevent exactly this type of situation. That cannot be right, one attorney said immediately. Check again. The analyst did. Then a third time. The result never changed. Melissa Grant. The room felt colder. Ethan leaned back in his chair. For a long moment, he said nothing. Melissa had worked beside him for nearly 8 years. She had helped navigate acquisitions, audits, investigations, and regulatory reviews. Trust was not built overnight. Neither was betrayal. Where is she now? Ethan finally asked. Another analyst checked the employee system. She left the building at 6:30 this evening. More silence. Claire noticed something unusual. Everyone was focused on the names. Richard Holloway, Melissa Grant. Yet nobody seemed focused on motive. Why risk everything? Why manipulate a merger of this size? Her eyes drifted back to the projected files. Rows of documents filled the screen. Hundreds of entries. Hundreds of details. Then something caught her attention. A folder name. Brief. Ordinary. Easy to ignore. Claire stared at it. Her heartbeat slowed. Excuse me, she said softly. The room immediately looked toward her. Ethan noticed it too. People now listened whenever she spoke. What is it? He asked. Claire pointed toward the screen. That folder. The analyst zoomed in. What about it? Claire studied the label carefully. Why would merger documents be stored there? Several people frowned. The folder belonged to an inactive project that had been closed almost 2 years earlier. It should have had nothing to do with the current transaction. The analyst opened it. Additional files appeared. Then more. Then dozens more. The room watched in stunned silence. Hidden among archived records were draft agreements nobody had seen before. Alternative versions. Revised ownership structures. Financial models. Different outcomes. Different beneficiaries. Ethan stared at the screen. His expression changed. Not anger. Not shock. Recognition. For the first time that night, the forged signature no longer looked like the objective. It looked like the distraction. The discovery changed the direction of the entire investigation. For hours, everyone had been staring at the signature. The forged name. The altered page. The missing approval trail. Now those details seemed smaller. Not unimportant. Smaller. Ethan Blackwell stood motionless as the hidden files continued appearing on the screen. One document became 10. 10 became 20. Financial projections. Ownership structures. Internal strategy papers. None of them belonged inside an archived folder from a project that had been closed years ago. How long has this been here? Ethan asked quietly. The analyst checked the metadata. His eyes widened. Some of these files were created more than 8 months ago. A murmur spread across the room. 8 months. That meant whatever was happening had not started yesterday. It had been developing quietly for nearly a year. Claire watched the reactions around the table. surprise, confusion, concern. Yet one thing stood out. Richard Holloway no longer looked defensive. He looked worried, not about himself, about what the files might reveal. Ethan noticed it too. Open the ownership projections, he said. The analyst obeyed. Numbers filled the screen. Percentages, equity transfers, voting structures, complex financial models. Most people in the room immediately understood what they were seeing. Several executives exchanged stunned looks. One attorney slowly sat down without saying a word. Another removed his glasses and stared at the screen. That is impossible, someone whispered. Ethan's expression hardened. Explain it. The attorney pointed toward the ownership structure. If this version had been approved, control of the merged company would gradually shift. Ethan remained silent. Shift to whom? The attorney swallowed. A private investment group. More files opened. More names appeared. Shell companies. Investment vehicles. Layers of corporate ownership designed to be difficult to trace. Yet the pattern was becoming clear. The forged signature had never been the final objective. It had merely been the mechanism needed to approve a much larger change hidden inside hundreds of pages of legal language. Claire felt a chill run through her. Not because of the money involved. Because of the patience involved. Someone had spent months building this. Planning it. Hiding it. One tiny detail at a time. Then another analyst spoke. I found something else. Nobody seemed surprised anymore. The evening had become a series of discoveries. What is it? Ethan asked. The analyst enlarged a communication log recovered from the archived folder. Several messages had been deleted. Most were unrecoverable. Most. One fragment remained. Only a single sentence. The room leaned forward. The sentence appeared on the screen. If Blackwell signs, everything moves forward next quarter. Nobody spoke. Ethan stared at the words. Not because they proved guilt. Because they proved intent. Someone had been waiting for his signature. Counting on it. Building an entire plan around it. Across the room, Claire looked at the message. Then at the dates attached to the files. Then back to the message again. Something felt familiar. Not the words. The timing. A pattern was beginning to form in her mind. Quietly. Slowly. The same way the signature had first stood out hours earlier. And deep down, Claire realized they were finally getting close to the truth. The closer they moved toward the truth, the quieter the room became. Nobody was celebrating the discovery. Nobody felt victorious. Every new answer seemed to reveal a deeper question beneath it. Ethan Blackwell stood beside the conference table, staring at the recovered message displayed on the screen. If Blackwell signs, everything moves forward next quarter. The sentence was simple, almost ordinary, yet it carried the weight of months of planning. Track every communication connected to that folder, Ethan said. Analysts immediately began working. New records appeared. Email routes, approval chains, archive histories, the digital footprints of people who believed nobody would ever follow them. Claire watched silently. Something about the timeline still bothered her. The dates, the sequence, the rhythm of the activity. She had learned long ago that patterns often revealed more than facts. Facts could be hidden. Patterns were harder to disguise. As another report appeared on the screen, her eyes narrowed slightly. There it was again. A date. Then another. Then another. All separated by almost exactly 30 days. That is strange, she whispered. Ethan turned toward her immediately. What is? Claire pointed toward the timeline. The uploads. One analyst enlarged the records. What about them? Claire studied the screen carefully. They were not random. The room listened. Most people make changes when they need something. She pointed again. These changes happened on a schedule. The analyst compared the dates. His expression shifted. She is right. Several attorneys leaned forward. Monthly intervals, one of them said quietly. Almost identical every time. Ethan folded his arms. Why does that matter? Claire thought for a moment. Because this was not someone reacting to opportunities. Her voice remained calm. This was someone following a plan. Silence followed. The observation felt obvious once spoken aloud. Yet nobody had noticed it. The room returned to the records with renewed focus. Suddenly, an attorney requested a list of everyone who participated in monthly merger reviews. Another analyst cross-referenced attendance records. The list became shorter. Then shorter still. One by one, names disappeared. Vacation schedules eliminated some people. Travel records eliminated others. Security logs removed several more. Eventually, only a handful remained. Ethan stared at the final list projected on the screen. Richard Holloway, Melissa Grant, and one additional name nobody expected, Charles Benton, outside legal consultant, independent advisor, not a company employee, not subject to the same internal oversight. The room grew still. How often did Benton attend these reviews? Ethan asked. Every single one, an attorney replied. More files were opened. More records compared. Then another discovery emerged. Charles Benton had connections to the private investment group hidden inside the alternative ownership structure. Not direct connections, indirect ones. Layers removed, carefully concealed, but present. Ethan slowly exhaled. The picture was finally beginning to make sense. The forged signature, the hidden files, the altered ownership structure, the monthly updates. Separate details were becoming a single story. Yet Claire noticed something else, something nobody had mentioned. She looked at the projected attendance records one more time. Then she looked toward Ethan. "Mr. Blackwell," she said softly, "I think they expected you to notice eventually." Several people frowned. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Why would they expect that? Claire looked back at the timeline. Because if they only wanted the signature, they would have hidden everything. Her gaze moved across the recovered files. Instead, they left a trail. The room fell silent once more. And for the first time that night, Ethan realized they might not be investigating a hidden plan anymore. They might be standing exactly where someone intended them to stand. The realization settled over the room slowly, like fog rolling across water. Nobody spoke for several seconds because nobody liked the implication. If Claire was right, then the hidden files were not merely evidence. They were bait. Someone had expected them to be found. Someone had wanted the investigation to follow a particular path. Ethan Blackwell walked toward the screen and studied the timeline again. Every detail now looked different. Every record carried a second meaning. If this was intentional, one attorney said carefully, then somebody wanted us focused on Richard Holloway and Melissa Grant. Richard sat silently. The accusation no longer seemed theoretical. Yet Ethan noticed something important. Richard looked frightened. Not guilty. Frightened. There was a difference. Claire noticed it too. People hiding the truth usually protected themselves. Richard seemed confused by it. "Pull every communication involving Charles Benton," Ethan said. Analysts immediately returned to work. The room filled with the quiet sounds of keyboards and notifications. Outside, Manhattan glowed beneath the rain. Inside, the investigation continued, moving forward one detail at a time. Then another report appeared. The analyst reviewing Charles Benton's records frowned. "This is strange." Ethan looked up. "What?" The analyst enlarged a communication log. "There are dozens of contacts between Benton and Melissa Grant." Nobody seemed surprised. Then the analyst opened another file. "But there is almost nothing between Benton and Richard Holloway." Several heads turned. Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Show me." The records appeared on the screen. Hundreds of messages, calendar invitations, calls, shared files, all connected to Melissa. Almost none connected to Richard. The room grew quiet again. The narrative everyone had assumed was beginning to crack. "That makes no sense," one executive whispered. Ethan nodded slowly. It did not. If Richard had been the central figure, there should have been a trail connecting him to Benton. Instead, there was almost nothing. Claire stared at the records. Then her eyes drifted toward another detail. A travel log attached to Benton's consulting reports. Her heartbeat slowed. The same feeling returned. The feeling she had experienced with the signature, with the timeline, with the hidden folder. Small details mattered. She pointed toward the screen. "Can you open that?" The analyst clicked the file. Travel records appeared. Cities, dates, meetings, conferences, routine business activity. At least it appeared routine. Then Claire noticed something. There. The analyst zoomed in. Several attorneys leaned forward. "What are we looking at?" Claire studied the dates. "The conferences." Ethan frowned. "What about them?" Claire pointed carefully. "Melissa attended every one." Silence. "And Richard?" Ethan asked. The analyst checked. His eyes widened. "He attended none of them." The room froze. Piece by piece, the picture was changing. Richard Holloway might have been connected to the altered documents. His workstation might have been involved. But the deeper pattern pointed somewhere else entirely. Ethan looked toward the empty chair where Melissa Grant normally sat during major transactions. For the first time that night, he stopped seeing her as a trusted compliance director. He started seeing her as the missing piece. And somewhere beyond the walls of Blackwell Tower, completely unaware that the truth was catching up to her, Melissa Grant was running out of places to hide. The clock on the conference room wall showed 9:43 p.m. What had begun as a routine merger meeting had transformed into something entirely different. Coffee cups sat forgotten. Legal folders remained open. Outside, the rain continued falling across Manhattan, turning the city lights into blurred streaks of gold and white. Inside Blackwell Tower, nobody wanted to leave. Not until the final pieces fit together. Ethan Blackwell stood at the head of the table, studying the evidence collected throughout the evening. The forged signature, the hidden files, the ownership changes, the communications with Charles Benton, the travel records connected to Melissa Grant. Separately, each detail raised questions. Together, they formed a pattern, a deliberate one. An analyst suddenly looked up from his workstation. We recovered another file. Every conversation stopped. Show us, Ethan said. The document appeared on the large screen. It was not a contract, not a financial report. It was a planning memorandum. Internal, confidential. The date matched one of the monthly meetings Claire had identified earlier. Silence filled the room as everyone read the opening paragraph. Then an attorney whispered, "There it is." Ethan stepped closer. The memorandum outlined a gradual transfer of influence within the future merged company. Not immediate control, gradual control, quiet control. Small changes that would have appeared insignificant individually, but powerful when combined over time. They were planning years ahead, one executive said softly. Another nodded. Nobody would have noticed until it was too late. Ethan remained silent. The realization was unsettling, not because of the scale of the plan, because of its patience. Someone had counted on everyone focusing on obvious numbers while ignoring subtle details. The exact mistake they almost made with the signature itself. Claire stared at the screen. Then something else caught her attention. A distribution list attached to the memorandum. Only 3 names appeared. Charles Benton, Melissa Grant, and a third individual whose name had not surfaced before. The room immediately noticed it. Who is Daniel Mercer? Ethan asked. Analysts began searching. Records appeared within seconds. Former consultant, contract employee, left the company nearly a year ago. Minimal visibility, minimal attention. The perfect person to disappear from memory. Yet his name appeared repeatedly throughout the archived files. We have been looking at the wrong center, Claire said quietly. The room turned toward her. Ethan listened carefully. Explain. Claire looked at the names on the screen. Everyone assumed the plan revolved around the merger. She paused. But the merger was only the opportunity. Several attorneys exchanged thoughtful glances. Ethan slowly nodded. He understood. The objective was never the deal itself. The objective was the influence created afterward. The forged signature had simply accelerated the process. The hidden files had coordinated it. The ownership structure would have completed it. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Ethan looked across the room toward Claire. The waitress who had entered carrying coffee now sat among attorneys, executives, and financial experts. Yet she looked exactly the same as she had hours earlier. Calm, quiet, unassuming. Claire, Ethan said, if you had not spoken tonight, none of this would have been found. The room fell silent. Not out of tension, out of respect. And for the first time that evening, every person at the table understood the same thing. The most important voice in the room had belonged to the person they almost ignored. The conference room was finally quiet. Not the tense silence that had filled the evening. A different silence. The kind that arrives after the truth no longer needs to defend itself. Shortly after midnight, the investigation reached its conclusion. The merger was suspended. The hidden documents were secured. Independent auditors were brought in. The evidence spoke clearly enough on its own. No dramatic confrontation was necessary. No speeches. No accusations shouted across a boardroom. Just facts. Careful facts. The way real justice often arrives. One detail at a time. Richard Holloway was formally cleared of any intentional wrongdoing after the records confirmed his workstation had been used without his knowledge during a period of authorized access sharing. Melissa Grant and Charles Benton were removed from all involvement pending the final legal review. The altered ownership structure was rejected. The forged signature was documented. The plan that had taken months to build collapsed because one person noticed a detail everyone else overlooked. Eventually, the attorneys began packing their files. Analysts shut down laptops. Executives gathered their coats. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Manhattan shimmered beneath fresh reflections and quiet streets. Ethan Blackwell remained standing near the window. He watched the city for a moment before turning toward Claire. She was collecting her tray, the same tray she had carried into the room hours earlier. Somehow that simple detail struck him harder than anything else. The room had changed. The company had changed. The future of a multi-billion-dollar merger had changed. Yet Claire remained exactly who she had always been. Calm, professional, unassuming. "You should not be carrying that anymore tonight," Ethan said. Claire smiled faintly. "It is still my job." Several people around the room laughed softly. Not because the comment was funny, because it was honest. Ethan walked over and extended his hand. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Claire shook it. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple. They carried more weight than any speech. "You saved this company." Claire looked around the room. At the lawyers, the executives, the analysts, the people who had spent years building something larger than themselves. Then she gently shook her head. "No," she said. "I just paid attention." Silence followed. Respectful silence. The kind that cannot be demanded, only earned. As Claire stepped toward the elevator, nobody saw a waitress leaving the room. They saw a person whose intelligence had spoken louder than status. A person who never raised her voice, never demanded recognition, never needed a title to prove her worth. The elevator doors opened. Claire stepped inside. The doors slowly closed. And for the first time all night, Ethan Blackwell smiled. Because he had been reminded of something success sometimes makes people forget. The most valuable person in the room is not always the one sitting at the head of the table. Sometimes it is the quiet one standing near the door. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to share your thoughts below. And if you believe dignity, kindness, and quiet intelligence still matter in this world, consider joining us for more stories like this. Because sometimes the smallest voice reveals the biggest truth.